Gardening can be really fun, but if you've never had a garden before, you might be a little overwhelmed. And it definitely can be overwhelming at first. But gardening is such a positive thing all around, and I don't want anyone to feel discouraged from starting a garden. So, here are some of my tips for beginner gardeners.
Number one is know your growing zone. You can easily find this information out by going to planthardiness.ars.usda.gov and enter your zip code in, and it will tell you what your zone is. Your growing zone will help tell you what plants might grow better in your climate, and for seed starting, the backs of your seed packs will usually mention what zones they are cold hardy in and can also tell you when you can start the seeds according to your zone. You will also want to figure out what your first and last frost dates are. You can find this out by going to almanac.com and entering in your zip code, and it will tell you when your estimated first frost date is and your estimated last frost date is. I feel like these are only somewhat accurate because my weather station is on top of a mountain that does get snow, but down in my microclimate, we don't get any kind of snow and we hardly get any kind of frost. But it can still give you a good idea for what the weather is going to be like and when it will be safe to plant certain things. You should also be aware of the sun patterns in your garden. You can go to suncalc.org and enter your address, and it will show you the sun pattern so you can know which areas get sun and for how long. You can also do sun mapping yourself by checking to see where the sun is and making a note of it each hour so you can total up how many hours of sun a certain area gets, so you can plant things that will get enough sun in that area. This can change slightly between seasons, but sun mapping can definitely give you a good idea of what you're dealing with. The next tip is to know your plant types. Are they annuals or perennials? Annuals will die and not come back each season, while perennials will, but they may have a shorter bloom time. I feel like perennials are more bang for your buck, so I don't usually grow annuals unless they are food-producing plants or are plants that are known as self-seeders, meaning they'll drop seeds and you'll have more plants come back as volunteer plants. But if you're getting perennials, some might be evergreen, meaning even if they are not in bloom, they will stay green, but others can be deciduous, meaning they will lose their leaves and could look dead before they come back to life in the next growing season for that plant. So I really suggest deciding what kind of plants you want to grow and whether you care about if they are evergreen or not. But it's also just good to know the type of plant that you're getting, because if an annual looks dead, it probably is dead and can be removed. But if it's a perennial and looks dead, it's probably just dormant and you shouldn't remove it. Speaking of plant types, you should also have an idea of whether you want to grow food-producing plants or just landscaping plants. I am a fan of both, but I will always advocate for growing your own food, because if you're going to put in the effort, then you might as well get some food out of it too. But to grow really great food, you'll need the help of pollinators as well as other garden friends to eat pests for you. So even non-food producing plants have their place in the garden, because even if it's not food for you, it can be food for the beneficial insects and animals, and having plants that attracts them to your garden can help keep your ecosystem in check. And speaking of pests, pests are just a part of gardening. It happens and they can do a lot of damage. And in your first year of gardening, you may find that you have a ton of pests, most likely because your ecosystem isn't established yet. I used to get hornworms on my tomato plants each year, but last year I didn't see any. I'm sure there were some, but I think that the birds know they can come to my garden to get food, and I think they've been eating the hornworms while they stop by my garden. So don't be discouraged and don't use toxic pesticides. There are some organic solutions that can be helpful, and I definitely use them in my garden, but just make sure they don't kill off the good insects. But I still suggest encouraging those beneficial insects and animals to come to your garden by planting things they like. For example, ladybugs love dill, and they also love to eat aphids and can help clear an infestation. This brings me to my next tip, which is to try companion planting. The example of the ladybugs and dill can be considered companion planting, but it can also be when you use other plants to help deter certain pests from your vulnerable plants. Or it can be when you use what are considered trap crops, which are plants that are more attractive to the pests instead of the plants you're trying to protect. So it's definitely worth researching what plants go well with each other. And in some cases, some companion plants can even help other plants taste better. Many people say that planting basil next to tomatoes can really improve the taste of a tomato. Good soil is essential for having a successful garden. Knowing your soil type can go a long way, because some soil can be harder to grow in and some things grow better in a certain type of soil. There are soil tests you can get at nurseries or online that can help you determine what kind of soil you have, and you can see if it's appropriate for what you want to grow in that area or not. And once you know what kind of soil you have, you can figure out what amendments you'll need. The next tip is to remember to feed your plants and your soil because gardening can deplete the nutrients in soil. There are tons of fertilizers out there on the market with lots of different information on the packages because certain plants need a certain percentage of different nutrients. So at first it can be confusing, but if you're just getting started, I suggest getting plant-specific fertilizers, or you can even go simpler and try compost or worm castings. Worm castings are generally pretty safe to use because they won't burn your plants the way some compost or manure might if they aren't cooled down enough. When it comes to watering, you'll need to decide if you want to hand water or if you'll want to set up drip irrigation. I personally prefer hand watering because drip irrigation doesn't really work with the layout of my garden, but I also have the time to do it and I don't mind it. But if you have a busier schedule, then automatic drip irrigation might be right for you, especially if you end up with a lot of plants, which is the perfect segue into my next tip, which is to start small. You may be so anxious to get growing and want to grow everything your heart desires, but if you're new to gardening, you don't want to take on too much at once. Start with a small raised bed or section in your garden so you can really focus on it and get a feel for the needs of your plants. My next tip is to not spend a lot of money on tools right away. You will want the basics such as shovels, trowels, pruners, and I have to mention my Hori Hori knife because it is so versatile, but you don't want to buy a ton of stuff right out the gate. Get a few of the essentials to start, and then as you continue with your gardening journey, you can see what you actually need and get things as you need them. You can also usually find free tools on places like your local Buy Nothing group or on Nextdoor, or you can find cheap used tools on Marketplace or at garage sales. My next tip is to keep a plant journal. It doesn't have to be super involved. There are some fancy garden journals out there, but it can just be a document on your computer or phone or any notebook. But you should include things such as when you started a plant from seed or bought a plant, and any pest issues you noticed with your plants and how they performed for you, or just any other things you want to remember so that you can refer to your notes in the next year and can see what you did that worked and what didn't. My last tip is to not be afraid to try something if you're really interested in it. You may fail at growing a plant one year, but you can try to figure out what went wrong and try again the next season. Experimenting with gardening can be a great way to learn, and even though there are tried and true methods, they may not always work best for some people. I'm a big fan of learning by trial and error, especially if you end up finding something that works really well for you.
I hope you found these tips helpful. I know it was a lot of information, but there is a lot that goes into gardening, but it doesn't have to be difficult or overwhelming. And the most important thing is to just start. And each gardening season is an opportunity to learn and improve.